No mai, haere mai. Welcome to the Maxim Institute podcast. I'm Jason, the communications manager here at Maxim. Each week, we pair our latest column with an insightful conversation, taking you behind the scenes of our weekly columns and chatting with the authors to unpack the research, ideas, and discussions that shape their work. Get ready to dig into the latest topic. Today, we talk to researcher Thomas Scrimgeour about his recent column. Thomas, welcome along to the podcast. Always good to have you with us. We're talking about your latest column, Resurrectionists. Now, that's an interesting title. How did you come up with that? You talk about resurrectionists being body acquiring professionals of the early autopsy industry. Where did you get that, and how is that applicable to your column? Explain this to me, please.
Well, thanks for having me, Jace. So I guess I was looking at writing a column on the Labour Party conference and how you come back after what really was an electoral death. The previous election, Labour suffered a heavy defeat. And that wasn't just a move to the political right. You know, people fled further left as well. So it was Labour specifically who got eviscerated. And I was thinking that in terms of death. And then, you got to do the autopsy after death. Why did Labour die? And then I started wondering, how did they used to acquire bodies? And I went down this whole rabbit hole when I should have been doing my actual work, learning about the economics of body supply in early medical professions. And so there were these people called resurrectionists who were going through graves, digging up bodies to then sell to medical schools. And so, when you have a political party that has died, they need some resurrectionists to take the body to get it autopsied, to find the cause of death.
And bring it back to life in some ways, I think, as well. You talked about Labour doing their autopsy over the past year behind closed doors. A lot, this is what all, I think, political parties do. They have these behind closed doors discussions. Do you think the public misses out on something when that happens, or is that kind of the right and proper way to do it, and we should let them have their discussions and then present us with the outcomes, or should there be more transparency? What do you think?
Yeah, it's a really good question, I think. I mean, obviously after an election, the media and the commentariat do their own postmortem. Talking heads will have their reckons about what exactly went wrong. But I think there's a value in parties doing it for themselves. Certainly far fewer people are members of political parties these days than in previous generations. People get involved less. But for those who do, parties need to be able to have a discussion themselves about who they are, what they value, and what went wrong. I think the advantage of them having it behind closed doors, so to speak, both among caucus in Parliament and in the kind of wider party apparatus, is that it means people can have an internal argument without stressing too much about the party brand. It can be a real and substantive disagreement where they don't wear kiddie gloves because they don't want to seem divisive. So I think it's fair enough for parties to want to do it behind closed doors.
And we don't really miss out because we get the media opinion and people doing their own dissection. And often a lot of them are connected with party insiders and get the inside track and things like that. So after the post-mortem, they had their conference and they presented the results, I guess you would, of the autopsy. And they presented a whole raft of things that they might present at the next election, platforms that they might have going forward. And there's a particular focus on finance and the current government's financing, and particularly Barbara Edmonds, you quote there, talking about economic vandalism to describe the tax cuts, and austerity to describe some of these things as well. Is this politicking by Barbara Edmonds, or is she building a case? Is she laying the foundation for something going forward? What do you reckon?
I mean, I think there's probably a bit of politicking and a bit of substantive policy disagreement there. But certainly she's laying the platform for what I think will be a sustained attack on the government going forward. So she describes specifically the government's tax cuts as economic vandalism. And this is part of the broader debate about whether these tax cuts are funded by debt or funded by spending savings. And it sort of depends about how you organize your books. So the government have promised and implemented tax cuts and also cut government spending by about the same amount. So the government's position is this is fully costed. We're not funding these tax cuts by taking on more debt. But the other side of that is the government is still running a deficit. The government is still spending more money than it is bringing in. And so in that sense, if there hadn't been a tax cut, there would have been a smaller deficit. So the government would be taking on less debt than it currently is. So I think Barbara Edmonds has a reasonable line of attack here. She also described Nicola Willis as running an austerity budget. And that's probably where it's hard to go all the way with her. Yes, there have been spending cuts, but as I just mentioned, the government is spending out of debt. It's not austerity. It's not a restrictive, balanced budget. It's an expansionary budget. The government is spending more money than it takes in, and that puts a growth pressure on things, not an austerity one.
So then, a couple of things I think coming out of that. One is this a fair criticism, given that Labor ran deficits previously, and now it's easy when you're in opposition to get more firepower, I guess, and to be more critical when you're not in charge and you're not making the calls with the responsibility of having to follow through on it. And why not cut spending instead of increasing tax? It seems to be the other way to come at it. If you're spending more than you're bringing in, why not cut the spending and not raise taxes?
Yeah, so I'd say it's partially a fair enough criticism. Certainly, Labor in the latter half of their government after COVID radically increased government spending and started running some quite large deficits. And it looks like it's very difficult to wind all of that back. But for the first couple of years of the Labor government, they did run a budget surplus. So there is something to be said there that it was not a complete run deficits all the time government. But I think more importantly, Barbara Edmonds and Labor more generally are wanting to distance themselves from the COVID era. They don't want to disavow what they did, but they want to say that it was exceptional and extraordinary circumstances, and we did what was necessary, but now we need to do something different. There is also the third way. I mean, this kind of, you mentioned, should we not cut spending rather than raise taxes? And cutting spending, raising taxes are the two, and then economic growth is really the one that allows, that forgives all sins, that if you grow the size of your economy, your debt matters less, and actually, even if your tax rates stay the same, you should raise more tax revenue. More money should come in, because when you have a corporate tax and the businesses are more profitable, then the government gets a bit more of a slice as well. But productivity or economic growth is hard to generate. I think, whether we should be cutting spending or raising taxes is the perennial question that does exist in politics. It's probably fair to say that it would be hard for a Labor finance person to say we should be spending less money. But it is a strong sign that Barbara Edmonds sees being credible about spending a lot of money means doing that in a financially prudent way.
Well, one of the ways that they have suggested that they would cover that gap and be, put that, close that gap and be able to keep the spending as it is to put capital gains tax back on the table. How do you think that will play out, given that you've said here that taxes are never popular, but some people may bite the bullet with this? How do you think, particularly with the capital gains tax suggestion, that might go?
Yeah, it is an interesting one because capital gains taxes have been floated for a long time. They've always been hovering around. And then I think there's certainly a large portion of the Labor base who are very upset that when Labor had an absolute majority, they didn't implement a capital gains tax. Because as far as government policies are concerned, bringing in new taxes is easier than many things. It's much easier than building a hospital, right? Bringing in a new tax just means drafting some legislation, and you have to kind of look to make sure there aren't unforeseen consequences. but there isn't this sort of long-term kind of arc of infrastructure, which is really complicated. So capital gains taxes are tricky in terms of popularity. You do often see these headlines where, a majority of New Zealanders support a capital gains tax. And so it can seem like, this could be something people are really on board with. But when you dig in further and prod on those numbers, often what is being said is that New Zealanders support a capital gains tax that would apply to other people. That there are exclusions for things like the family home. But as soon as you start doing these complicated things where you make exclusions for certain forms of capital gain, you just increase the complexity and therefore compliance costs. But also, if you exclude the family home, so you're not taxing middle New Zealand more, but you're taxing the rich people more, you actually exclude most of the houses. And so then you just don't generate as much revenue as you wanted anyway. So I don't think, on balance, if a capital gains tax was taken to the New Zealand electorate and then criticised from the other side of the house, I don't think it is popular, but I do think under the right circumstances, New Zealand would get used to it. There's a whole bunch of things which at the time of implementation aren't that popular, but just sort of hang around. John Key famously raised GST, and his own voters were really not supportive of that. The national base were not super excited about paying more tax. But GST didn't get reduced when the new government came in. Sometimes things, even when they're unpopular, if they get brought in, just hang around anyway.
Yeah. Well, that's one of their ideas, and it may or may not draw voters back to them. But if you were a Labour strategist and you had to advise them on what they should do between now and the next election in a couple of years' time, what would be your advice for them to kind of at least be maybe not make a full-on resurrection comeback and take government, although you've said that's not out of the realm of possibility, but at least to be competitive in the next election? What would your advice to them be?
Yeah, well, when writing the column, my mind went back to the American political strategist James Carville, who very famously was running Bill Clinton's campaign for president, and he hung up in all of their election offices just the four-word slogan, "It's the economy, stupid." He's from Louisiana, he's from the South, and he's a rough-talking kind of guy, but he wanted to make sure that the campaign wasn't talking about things that people didn't care about. And so for him, at that time, it was the economy. And I think that is true for Labour as well. In the previous election, they did kind of talk about bread and butter issues was their slogan. But I think they need to keep hammering home these things, the concerns of ordinary Kiwis, and not get caught in the trap of thinking that whatever it is that political staffers and political enthusiasts care about, that is what the New Zealand electorate cares about. So, Barbara Edmonds attacking the government for economic vandalism. We're in a tough economic time. And so if they can tie the government to unemployment rates in people's minds, that's a really, really strong thing to be talking about because people care about employment. I think biting at every kind of culture war issue is perhaps not going to win them many votes because most people, most of the time, are not concerned about the ins and outs of what happens in the House and Parliament. And so making sure you hammer home the message about ordinary Kiwis, bread and butter issues will set them in good stead.
So basically forget the policy wonk talk and just speak like everyday middle New Zealand. Thomas, thanks for being with us, and lots to think about coming out of this column. But thanks for your thoughts.
Thanks for having me, Jace. Autopsies are an ugly business, but the insight gained is irreplaceable. In the early days of the medical profession, grave robbing became a minor industry to provide cadavers for medical research. The body acquiring professionals were known as resurrectionists. Over the past year, Labour has conducted its autopsy behind closed doors, away from the nosy public. Last weekend, we saw the first display of what Labour has learned from its post-mortem at its annual conference in Christchurch. Hipkins promised rail-enabled ferries, a full rebuild of the Dunedin Hospital, reusing a policy from 2017, and denounced any New Zealand involvement in the AUKUS military pact. All policies designed to function primarily as a tax on the current government. Finance spokesperson Barbara Edmonds, anxious to rebuild Labour's financial credibility, declared the national tax cuts as economic vandalism, contrasting with her promise to be a pragmatic steward of the public purse. Edmonds took the criticism a step further, accusing her counterpart Nicola Willis of austerity, an accusation that sits awkwardly with the government's love affair with budget deficits. The policy elephant in the room was tax. Nothing was announced, but the party has voted to continue working on capital gains and wealth tax proposals. Taxes are never popular, but if Labour has a well-defined proposal on the table, with plenty of time on their hands, the electorate may hold their nose and vote for it. By the government's own numbers, they won't run a budget surplus until at least 2027, so the economic case for higher taxes could be substantial. Not all messaging has been within Labour's control. The first phase of the COVID-19 review, released last week, raised questions about Hipkins' performance. Particular attention was paid to the vaccine mandates, which were applied too broadly and remained in place for too long, which caused harm to individuals and families and contributed to a loss of social capital. But Hipkins has been able to take the report on the chin. It's hard to imagine the electorate will still be fixated on COVID-19 come 2026. For the most part, key figures stuck to their lines, focusing on the bread and butter issues that survived Hipkins' policy bonfire at the last election. Voters will disagree about whether Labour has the solutions, but at the very least, they're discussing the right problems. Democrat political strategist and Bill Clinton's campaign manager, James Carville, immortalized himself in political history with 4 simple words. It's the economy, stupid. Politicians always face the temptation to focus on everything but the issues the voting public cares about. In the lead up to the most recent US election, Carville foresaw the results in a now infamous interview about the Democratic campaign. Labour has passed through the messiest part of electoral death with minimal fallout. The autopsy is over. What comes next will show whether or not they have learned their lesson. The Kiwi tendency to give governments a second term by default means that winning the next election is unlikely. But who knows? The Resurrectionists may just rise again.
Thanks for tuning in to the Maxim Institute podcast. If you want to stay updated on our latest research and insights into New Zealand politics and policy, sign up for our monthly forum email and event invites on our website. Be sure to subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, or your favorite podcast platform so you never miss an episode. From the team at Maxim, mā te wā. Goodbye for now.